I'm Eric Wolf. I teach anthropology at Lehman College in the Bronx, and I have long been interested in peasants and the context in which they live, both in the Caribbean and in Mesoamerica, Mexico and Guatemala especially. Well, I think the Caribbean has had a different definition at different periods. During the first phase after the Spanish penetration into the Americas, it was primarily a set of sea lanes and support bases for Spanish contact with the silver mines, either in Mexico or in Peru, Bolivia. So the main Spanish interest was in supplying boats and securing bases for ships going to and from the mainland, a kind of corridor. And the second phase of the Caribbean, I think, was initiated when other European powers came in and began to dispute that Spanish control of the Caribbean, establish bases on other islands, introduce contraband as well alongside of the Spanish trade, and fight for control of the area. But then quickly found also that many of the islands lent themselves to production of cash crops, especially sugar. And so that during the second phase you have, it's a battleground between different European nations, and at the same time a basis for capital accumulation on the basis of sugar production and slave labor brought in from Africa. And I think the third phase comes after sugar production declines a bit, the slave trade ends, contract labor is brought in from other parts of the world, but in the 19th century, essentially, towards the end of the 19th century, there's a downturn in the importance of sugar. And what happens then in modern period is a kind of initiation of a fourth phase in which you have not labor migration or forced labor migration into the Caribbean, but the Caribbean becomes a kind of source of labor for the mainland. So the Caribbean is something different at each of these different stages.
If we don't do it together, because really the forces against the change are really very strong.
Could I say something to that? I think there is a way of defining the Caribbean narrowly in terms of the island chains and the sea lanes that connect them, and for a primary area of the Caribbean, and then to look at the perimeter, the mainland as secondary. To some extent, I think the political interests of the various European and now American powers have played into this because they make every island a separate universe unto itself. And one of the things that I see coming out of a conference of this kind that we've had here, or discussion, is a double re-evaluation of this. One in the direction of mainland or outside interests in the Caribbean interacting in a kind of dialectic with the islands all the time. Invasion is the most extreme form. I mean, it comes from somewhere else and impinges on the island. But also in that other history of the people themselves living lives within this area, there are a lot of connections among the islands. I mean, people involved in contraband, piracy, landed at each other's coves. Miskito Indians from the Nicaraguan Atlantic coast were taken to Jamaica to put down slave rebellions. Venezuelan plantation owners, after the collapse of the Spanish Empire on the mainland, took their slaves and came to Puerto Rico. So that there's been an interaction all the time on the level of people moving back and forth, or the great Jamaican diaspora all over the Caribbean, which has taken Jamaicans to Panama to build the Panama Canal, to Cuba to work in the sugar fields, to the mainland in the United States, now to London and England. I mean, that links together areas of the Caribbean in the people's history, in that sense.
Also, very important elements that we could.
The point you raise about the sort of relevant level of political integration and management, I think is a serious one. It may not be possible to translate, common cultural currents into viable common political structures. I mean, having briefly been to St. Kitts and Nevis, for instance, even those two little islands are very different. They have a very different structure. One is more plantation-oriented, was more plantation-oriented, the other one more small farm-oriented, different lines of migration and so on. What each of these places needs is somewhat different. Santo Domingo, Cuba, and Puerto Rico certainly may be Las Tres Hermanitas, three sisters, but they're sometimes hostile sisters or different sisters anyway. And at the same time, so there must got to be some kind of political expression of particularity. And smallness may be a virtue in this. On the other hand, I think of the way, let's say, political life is organized in New York State. There are lots of municipalities and towns that are very small that have jurisdictions over particular territories. Their problems, however, are the same. Real estate interests don't care where they land, but they manage to take these divisions and benefit by them to create office buildings and road construction and feed capital accumulation in a way which is quite detrimental to the localities, but the localities have no way of confronting this invisible giant. And I suspect that that is very often the case in the Caribbean. That is, although one is linked by fate to a small space and has sort of, there are particular problems in that place. The problems that face the Caribbean, militarism, imperialism, control from the outside, the movement of capital, are global general problems. And the small islands can become sort of sitting ducks for this kind of. Well, it's an interesting question. I think that it is becoming more proletarianized everywhere, in the sense that more and more people depend upon wage labor for much or most of their subsistence. That very process very often sets off contradictions. One of which is that there may not be continuous employment, and you have to look for other kinds of ways of supplementing wage labor. And the way in which you do this and the different things that you combine to do it may make you, part-time fisherman, a horticulturalist, a seller of lottery, as well as a wage laborer. And so that's one thing. Where wage labor is carried out, whether it's in Port-au-Prince or in New York, or whether you migrate, from one place to the other, puts you into different structures of labor. So that process of entering wage labor doesn't have uniform effects everywhere. And while I think it is a process that goes on, it varies greatly regionally within islands, and I think from island to island. Well, Well, I was going to add something to this discussion. I think you also get alliances across classes.
Yeah.
Because people, for quite diverse motives, sometimes find themselves on the same side. And the issue of who controls the state and who has something to say about resources affects both the bottom and the top. I mean, I was present once in Jamaica at a time when a group of American financiers came in to an office of a Jamaican official and who had some jurisdiction over land in Jamaica, and they were going to buy the West Coast from him. You know, and that man came out of that discussion so humiliated and feeling so terrible that I could easily see him then taking a very different position and politically after that discussion than before the discussion. That must happen all the time. So there are cross currents as well and cross-cutting alliances.